Welcome to today's presentation on how forms and workflows help save a SharePoint implementation. Hi, I'm Dean Virag and I'll be your presenter. Let's go ahead and get started. It's important to note that today's presentation is not a technical presentation. This is a business level presentation. We're not going to be getting into any technical details of how the forms were created or what we did to create them. We're going to be talking about the business cases, kind of what were the before processes and then what were the after processes when we implemented the forms, and what was the improvement that the folks that were started using the forms, what improvements did they see? So as every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and today's presentation is a story. So I'm going to take the first part of the presentation and use it to introduce the characters. I'm going to use it to introduce the setting, a little bit about the company that we did these forms and workflows for. Then I'm going to talk about, in the middle of the presentation, I'm going to give examples of many of the form and workflow solutions that we created. And what you'll notice in the graph here, you'll see, is that as time went on, as we implemented more and more of these solutions, we actually helped increase user adoption of SharePoint. What was really interesting, and I'm going to say this a couple times, you'll probably hear this from me a couple times through the presentation, is that although user adoption of SharePoint increased, the end users didn't realize in many cases that they were using SharePoint. And that was kind of interesting because you'll see what kind of part that played when I talk about the conflict. And every good story has got conflict, and so does mine. So we're going to talk about at some point in time, something happened, and we'll get to that later, but it could have had two outcomes. The first outcome could have been disastrous, and that is that the SharePoint implementation could have been completely yanked and something else could have been put in its place. However, what ended up happening is that the SharePoint implementation continued on after the conflict had happened. Although the rate of user adoption slowed considerably for a time being, it did continue. So to begin, we need to go back into time. We're going to go back to the year of 2010. So what's out? SharePoint 2007 is out, and we have a brand new shiny SharePoint 2010. Along with it, we have an improved version of InfoPath and SharePoint Designer. And for me, most importantly, we had a blossoming SharePoint community. We had a lot of thought leaders that were taking time, and they were sharing their thoughts and ideas in blogs and videos and all sorts of goodness out there to learn SharePoint. So I took advantage of all that, and that's really what got me excited and inspired to do the things that I did from 2010, between 2010 and 2014. So a little bit about me. That's me in the year 2010. You can't see me now, but I've got a whole lot more gray hair now than I do then. But I'm a technical trainer. That's my background. I've done it for about 20 years, instructional design, technical training. Before I started at this organization back then, in 2009 is when I started, but back in 2010, I had no SharePoint experience. I've heard about SharePoint, but I never used it. The company had SharePoint, obviously, and I knew about it, and I noticed that nobody was really using it. And for me, it's very important as a trainer that people understand what technologies they have available to them and what those technologies can do for them. And that really spurred me on to learn SharePoint and help develop solutions and help people understand what they can do with the tool. And kind of as a fun side note, when that picture was taken back in 2000 and late 2009, that's the last time I actually ever wore a suit to work. So that's kind of, I feel very lucky in that sense. So the company, the name changed. This is a fictitious name. We Do Good, a nonprofit for helping everyone, but the company was primarily a membership organization. They had about 150,000 members worldwide, and they were a producer of content. So they produced a monthly magazine. They published books, worked with many external authors. They had and we're going to cover this a little bit later on, but they have an in-house multimedia staff with its own full-blown studio, video recording studio, and an audio booth. They also put on several large conferences throughout the year. The largest of those conferences had an attendance of between 10 and 15,000 people, so it was a really pretty big deal. And they held a lot of smaller learning events throughout the year. So the company had typical company functions like HR and finance and legal, but as I said in the previous screen, because they did all these really unusual things, they also had a lot of unique company functions. So for example, they had their own in-house copy and print center, and that's so they could print all the materials that were used in the conferences and the training sessions throughout the year. They had a creative services unit who was, and we'll cover this a little bit later, but it was made up of design services, graphics artists, editorial services, doing proofreading and grammatical checking of printed material, and the multimedia services. In addition, they had a meeting in their own in-house meeting and travel, because lots of people in the company travel, so they had their own essentially travel agency within the company internally. And they had a dedicated conferences group whose job it was to put on and plan and put on these conferences. And they were busy all year round. So their history with SharePoint was kind of sketchy. They've been using it since 2003. When I got there, they had just implemented 2010. And mostly the units were using it kind of for self-promotion. They weren't using it for collaboration or anything else. The main thing was like, hey, this is my unit and this is what we do and these are the people in it, and that's about it. It was rarely updated, and the staff had little understanding about what SharePoint could do for them and how they could use it to collaborate and automate and do all those wonderful things that SharePoint does. And it really, really had a poor reputation, and that really was a carryover from when the first 2003 implementation went on. It wasn't very good, and people didn't forget that. So SharePoint was really like an old playground. Like I said, it was just kind of this old place that if you were brave, you went, and as you can see in this picture, you went with parental supervision. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't someplace that you wanted to go to do stuff. So we had a vision. We wanted to make SharePoint someplace that people wanted to go to and they wanted to use. So we wanted to make it modern and attractive and fun and easy to use. And so this is kind of our vision of what we wanted to make happen. So to kind of finish off on the intro, I'm going to talk a little bit about my SharePoint learning path. I started out as an end user, in that as a technical trainer, I had my own SharePoint site. I was a contributor. I was able to add content to that site, PowerPoint presentations. I did a lot of how-to videos and some knowledge-based information. But the more I used it, the more I wanted to be able to do. So I approached our IT staff and said, hey, can I become my site owner? And they gave me the evil eye and they said, just don't break anything. So I became a power user, and again, watching all the videos that really the early thought leaders were putting out there, I learned an awful lot, not just how to do stuff in SharePoint, but what SharePoint can do to solve business problems. And as time went on, I really just, I fell in love with SharePoint. It's really a fantastic tool. So I really began to evangelize the product and create solutions for folks within the organization. And that's what we're going to get into right now. So our first goal when we were starting out on all these forms was to go paperless. There was a very big effort, and it was very important to eliminate unnecessary paper usage. And it made for good reporting up the chain when you can say, hey, we automated, we took these paper-based forms and we created electronic forms, so we're not using the paper anymore. So it was very well received. So our first goal, like I said, was to go paperless. And our second goal was to do things cheap, easy, and fast. And I love this image because I found this just about a month ago. in here, it's June of 2015. I found it about a month ago on LinkedIn. Mark Miller, who was one of my early influencers with SharePoint, he posted this. My new working motto is, so I'm reminded every minute, is low cost projects, little effort, and immediate effect. And I saw this and I laughed. I said, because this was our philosophy back in 2010. And it's like, well, Mark Miller is just now kind of getting onto that. So I thought it was funny. But yeah, so we wanted to do things cheap, easy, and fast. We were looking for small projects to start out with. Easy projects, something that we could finish very quickly and have a fast turnaround time, but things that had an immediate effect. We weren't looking to change the way the company did business processes. We were just focused on, a user has a problem or a user is doing something manually. Let's automate it for that user and save them some time. So our first customer, and I say the company was going paperless because that's kind of a little bit of an oxymoron, because our first customer was the biggest user of paper within the organization, copy and print services. So as I said before, they had a fully dedicated copy and print service function, is in-house for really any kind of printed material that you would need. I use them a lot as a technical trainer for printing out exercise manuals and printing out printed forms of presentations, etc. So they were a very manual process. So let's kind of walk you through this. So they started out with a paper-based form. As a customer would go to their center, they'd pick up one of the paper-based forms, and maybe they'd fill it out there, or maybe they'd go back to their desk and fill it out. They'd come back down and they'd drop the form in the inbox. And then the print center staff, they would come get the form and they would then transcribe that into Excel. And if there were any other files that needed to be used, Word files or anything that needed to be printed, the customer would email that to them. And they would, print center staff would store those in a file share. And eventually, they'd start the print job, and when it was over, they would email the company when it was ready to be picked up. So let's take a look at some of the issues that I saw while they were following this process. And you got to understand, they did this process for a long time, and it worked for them. They didn't know of any other way they could do it. This is just what they did. So we saw a better way of doing things, and which we'll see here in a couple slides from now. But the issues with this, so you've got a customer filling out a paper-based form, which is time-consuming. And it's also chicken scratch. My handwriting is not very good. So if I were filling out one of these forms, then if they can't read something, then they'd have to come back to me and say, oh, we can't read what you put. What were you talking about? So the Dropbox, putting the forms in the inbox, it didn't happen very often, but every once in a while they would lose the forms, and it would turn into a, he said, she said. I put them in there, well, we couldn't find it. Well, I put it in there, well, we couldn't find it. So it didn't happen very often, but I know of a couple cases where it did, and the customer would then have to refill the form out again. So transcribing the form into Excel, again, it's time consuming, and it's also prone to errors. And the customer is emailing the jobs to print services. Again, they're sending something in an email, who then the folks were taking those files and they were putting it out into a file share. So now you've got duplication of the file, you've got the file in the email, and you've got the file out in the file share. And it was a crazy folder structure. It was difficult for them to find things. They had a large file issue. They couldn't email large files. It was pretty messy. And at the end, customer, when the project was done and ready to be picked up, at the end, they didn't really have any metrics about the type of work that they were doing or the type of work that they weren't doing. And for difficult jobs, they were saying that sometimes it took them a while to find the files for doing repeat jobs. So let's take a look at the process of the new process of what we did for them. So this is the form that I created. It was one of the very first info path forms that I ever did. And what was really nice about this is we utilized the show and hide feature. So the end users really like this, the fact that they only saw the information that was relevant to them and the choices that they selected. With the old paper forms, they had all the sections on the form, and it was very confusing to them as far as what they needed to be able to fill out. So this is a form that we created, a section of the form that we created. Now let's take a look at the workflow, the new flow process. So the new copy and print services process goes something like this. The customer will go online and fill out a form, and they can attach the job files directly to the form, and they can attach multiple files to the form. Print services will receive an automatic notification via email of a new job request. They'll go in and they'll start the print job, and when it's done, the customer will receive an automatic notification when it's ready to be picked up. Now the improvements, we decrease the time it takes to deliver a job, mainly because we eliminated the need for filling out manually the form. We eliminated the need to take that form and transcribe it into Excel. We decreased the errors due to the manual data entry. No more lost forms because everything is stored in a single forms library. The print job details and the files together, they were no longer in separate places, so it's very easy to find all jobs for the repeat work. And most importantly is now they have metrics. At the end of the year or the quarter, they could go back and they could look and say, okay, who are our customers? Who used our services? They can say, what kind of print jobs did we do the most of, or what kind of print jobs did we do the least of? So they could really get some insights that they didn't have before. So after that was done, the floodgates opened. It was unintended consequence, but since so many people use the the copy and print center services, they saw this new form and they saw how it was used, and people started calling us and say, hey, can you do that for us? So of course we can. So our next big customer was Creative Services. And as I said before, Creative Services was made up of 3 areas: design services, editorial services, and multimedia services. They were graphic artists. They do logo design. They set up photo shoots. Editorial services did copy editing and editing, substantive editing and proofreading. And multimedia services, as I said before, they have their own video studio in the office and their own sound booth, and they also had a very nice post-production editing setup. And they could do in-house clips, and they could do consultations, so they go out and do video shoots, all sorts of stuff. So each one of those units followed a similar process, and all of them involved a walk-up paper form, just like the copy and print center did. Well, I'm going to only go through one of the examples, and that's going to be through Creative Services. So again, just like the copy and print center is a very similar process. Again, the customer is filling out a paper form, putting it in an inbox. The creative services staff are transcribing it into Excel, and there's a repository for storing files in a file share, and they're emailing the customer when it's ready. And you're going to see many of the same issues as the print center had as well. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. So this is kind of a sample of the form, or part of the form that we did for Creative Services. As you can see, it gives the user an option of selecting the service that's needed, and just like the print service, it was a dynamic form. So for example, if you selected create a PDF, the area below would change and it would give you only those fields that were relevant to what they needed to know to create a PDF. And this was really welcome by the end users as well. So after the process is the customer completes the online form, and they can attach the job files. Again, they're attaching multiple files to the form. Creative Services receives an automatic email notification. What was really nice is the Creative Services manager could use the form to assign the work. And we had a people picker field that will show up, and they can just add the name of the graphic artist that was, or the person that was in charge of doing that work, and that gave them some now immediate visibility on who's doing what. So Creative Services would start the print job, and the customer would be notified when it's done, Anytime any changes were done to the project and the form was updated with the status, the customer would receive an email. This was also really, really beneficial and a useful feature to the end user. They liked knowing kind of what phase their product was in, that it's been started, or is it being worked on, or is it finished. And at the end, the customer would get an email saying, hey, your job is done. And just like before, we decreased the time it took to deliver a job. The errors were decreased due to manual entry, and there were no more lost forms. And again, as I said before, the two really big victories for them was the customers being able to receive a job status update. This was, like I said, this was very important to them. And now also metrics, and it's really a recurring theme. Now folks have insights into the work that they're doing. Now the creative services unit can say, okay, throughout the year, what kind of services did people use the most, or did people use the least? And do we need to change our service offerings? They could make those, they had those kind of insights. So we're kind of here in the history. Time has gone forward, and we've created some forms, and user adoption has started to increase. But as I said earlier, it's important to remember that although user adoption was increasing, a lot of people didn't realize that when they were using these forms that they were using SharePoint. So the next example I'm going to give is some work that we did for financial services. And I believe this is the last example where I go into detail. After this, I'm just going to kind of cover the high level and show you all the solutions that we created for some of the different units. So financial services was interesting. I was helping one of their staff members with an unrelated project, and he was doing something I was asking him about. He had a question about Excel, and I was like, well, what are you trying to do? And he explained it to me. I'm like, ooh, how would you feel if we could automate this for you? And here it's important to note that whenever I was dealing with the customers, I never forced a solution upon anybody. I always formed it in a question, and I put it on them. Okay, so you're doing it this way. How would you feel if I could automate this process? So maybe it's taking you 20 minutes to do it now. Maybe after we automate it, it might take you 5 minutes. How would you be interested in that? And once I got their buy-in and yes, their agreement, then I'd go forth and do the work. So for financial services, they created a back order report. Again, the company had an inventory of materials. And this is something that every day this gentleman would go into our financial system and he would generate this report and he would submit it to a bunch of folks. So the flow is, as I said, he'd run the back order report from the financial system. He would export it to Excel and add his own comments and analysis. And this is not something that could be automated. This was his insight into what's going on and his knowledge that he would add to the report. And he would save that file into a file share, and then he would also attach it to an email out to a distribution group. So the problems here are, you had a daily email with an attachment to a large distribution group, so you're clogging up the Outlook or the Exchange with a bunch of attachments. If the report changed throughout the day, you'd have to send another one out. And again, you've got all of these instances of that file going everywhere. Which version is the truth? If something changes, does somebody necessarily know? Can they guarantee that what they're looking at is the most current version? And saving each spreadsheet as a unique file in the file share, they had over 400 files. And I asked him a question, did anybody ever request to see an old version? And he said no. I'm like, okay, so that's something to think about. So he was just saving it just to be on the safe side. He was saving it, and he had 400 files to be on the safe side. So what we did for them, the first 2 steps of the process stayed the same. You can't do much about that. You're going into the financial system, you're running the report, and you're adding the custom commentary to the report. But then things changed. So what I did is I had the user save the Excel file as a PDF in a document library. And I created a web page with that PDF embedded on it. So what happened is that when he saved it as a PDF, that web page would automatically update with the most current PDF. And as the PDF was saved in the library, that's when an automated email would go out to the distribution group. And that email message had a link to the page with the embedded PDF on it. So nobody ever got an attachment. They'd click the link, it would take them to the page, they'd see the report, and if they wanted to, then they could save the report using the embedded Adobe Acrobat Viewer. They could save the report to their local hard drive if they wanted to. So that's the after, and it was met with wonderful success. And I recently ran into this gentleman, and I said, I asked him, how's it going? Are you still using? He goes, absolutely, still using to this day. So easy to use. So that was a good little victory. Now, the improvement, what I really love about this solution is that it only took me 2 hours to develop. So 2 hours worth of my time, and years later, he's still using it. That's what I mean by low cost and immediate impact and long-lasting benefit. So he's emailing a link to a web page instead of including it as an attachment. And as I said before, the customers can download the PDF if they want it. Otherwise, they can just go to the page and look at the report. And I was able to delete all 400 of those old versions from the file share. So that made the IT folks very happy, and I cleaned up some space. So the next example I'm going to give is what we did for meeting and conference planners. And I'm not going to go into as much detail. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk about all the different forms that we created for them. So their job was to put on meetings, and they came to me and they say, well, we don't currently do this, but we would like some new functionality. So they asked for the following forms. They wanted a meeting request form. So if you wanted to have a meeting inside the building, you could fill out this request form, and you could select things like what kind of audiovisual equipment do you need, what kind of room layout do you want, etc. What time, which room do you want. Then they wanted a group travel request form, an emergency contact form, a food and beverage order form. This is really interesting because let's say, for example, that I'm going to be off-site hosting an event. I can use the food and beverage order form to let them know what kind of stuff that they need to order for the event, which was really well received as well. So the staff housing form, so the staff housing and the emergency contact form were bolded for a reason, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. But then the staff presenter audiovisual form, if I'm presenting, so what kind of audiovisual equipment do I need? Do I need a projector? Do I need a lavalier, a mic? Do I need multiple projectors? What do I need to do my presentation? But the two forms I want to talk about, again, are the emergency contact and the staff housing. One of the biggest problems that they had was that in order to attend the big annual conference as a staff, you needed to submit an emergency contact form, and this was a pain point for them. They struggled so much to try to get emergency contact forms from everybody. And they said even every once in a while, some people would slip through the cracks and they would never get the information. So what I did is that I combined the two forms into one. So if you were attending annual conference and you wanted to have housing, you wanted to have a place to stay, you needed to fill out the staff housing form. But before you could do that, I made it so you had to complete the emergency contact form before you could actually get to the staff housing form. And that completely solved their problem. They had 100% of all the users had filled out the emergency contact form, and that was a big win for them and for us. So that's the meeting and conference planners. Next group I'm going to talk about is human resources. And what's really important to note, we did an inventory of all the content on the intranet at this organization, and we discovered that human resources information occupied it comprised about 85% of the content on the intranet. So when it came to forms and workflows, why should they be any different? I mean, look at all of these forms and workflows that they had. And they just kept coming and coming and coming. I spent a good part of a year just doing workflows for the HR department and forms. Compressed work week request. If you want a degree or certificate program, you wanted to, they did reimbursement. You can fill out a form for there. Employee referral, rewards and recognition. The list goes on and on. The bolded, the monthly and quarterly report is the one I really want to talk a little bit about. So they were very big into, keeping track of your reporting and kind of what you were working on. So what we were able to do is create a form that had every unit goals and of course the overall organizational goals. So as you're filling out the form, it was smart enough. It knew what unit you belonged to, and therefore it would display just those unit goals that belong to your unit. And as you're typing in your monthly status reports or quarterly status reports, you could tie those into a unit goal, and that's something that they didn't really have before. On the form also, we had metrics, and so people were able to supply metrics on their forms. And at the end of the year, when people were responsible for filling out their annual review, they just had to go back to these quarterly report forms that they filled out and essentially copy and paste, and it was a huge time saver. So we did all these forms for the HR department, and again, they were all well received, and they saved a lot of time and provided a lot of insight throughout the year. The next example that I would like to present is what we did for legal services. Now, legal services ended up being an incredibly important customer for us, and I'll explain why in a couple slides. But one day I got a phone call from the head general counsel at the organization, and she called me up and she was saying that, Dean, we've used a lot of the forms that you've created for other people, and we would like some forms ourselves. So we had a chat, we met and talked, and she explained that they create contracts every day for people throughout the organization. And here's a list of the different types of contracts that they create. Part of their problem was they had no standardized way of collecting information for those contracts. The old process would have been that somebody would either email or call up legal services and say, I would like a non-disclosure agreement. And they'd say, okay, who's it for? And they'd ask for the specific information. It was really time consuming, especially if some of these contracts require some pretty specific details. So they asked to have the forms created, and every form was different. Every form had the fields that were necessary to complete in order for the legal services to complete that type of contract. So in the end, it was extraordinarily successful. When it came time to do their annual reporting, the head general counsel of the organization, who reports directly to the chairman, listed these forms as one of her major successes throughout the year. So their improvements also were the metrics. They were able to say, okay, as a group or as a unit, what kind of contracts are we creating more of than others? And they were able to use existing forms as well. So here we are in the history, and here we are in the story. Right? As more time has gone by, we've created a lot more forms for folks, and again, user adoption. People are using these forms are a daily part of their lives. And as I've said a couple times before, a lot of folks didn't realize that they were using SharePoint when they were doing these forms, and that's important because the next section we're going to talk about the conflict. What happened? And real quick, to summarize, these are just some of the forms that we created. I couldn't list them all, but we did about 50 some odd form solutions for folks. Again, all well received, and all of them used on a daily basis. So what happened? What's the conflict that happened? So we had a director of IT who resigned. He got a better job somewhere else. So in the person's replacement, they hired a new CIO, Chief Information Officer, and I have a few other acronyms, words for that three-letter acronym. But so he came in and he was all smiling, and he said, why, yes, SharePoint is important, and we're going to keep it. Smiling and confidence, and SharePoint's a good tool, and it's our collaboration tool of choice. So. But as a new CIO, he went and did his rounds of interviews, like any good new executive should do, and get a pulse for the feeling of the IT department. So he went around and just interviewed the staff, and in addition to a bunch of other questions, but he asked them all questions about SharePoint. And a lot of them said, well, I don't use SharePoint. Because they really weren't. Well, at least they didn't think they were. They were using the forms all over the place, but they didn't realize it. And that answer, I'm not using SharePoint, caused a dramatic change in the CIO. Yes, he had it out for SharePoint. And he laid the edict down. No more development, no more custom development in SharePoint. And he really had his mind set on ripping out SharePoint. So one of the things that happened as a result of this was no more SharePoint, no more need for a SharePoint administrator or evangelist. So I lost my job there, but that's okay. I ended up where I am now, and it was a fantastic move. So it was a nice thing that actually happened. So he wanted to rip out SharePoint, but what he then realized is that when he went and took a look at the inventory was the fact that we had all of these forms and solutions. So he sent one of his staff out to talk to the owners about all these solutions, and I think he was expecting more of the same. Oh, the solutions are horrible; it's not working. But he got just the opposite. Everybody said, "Oh, this is a vital. These forms and workflows, they're vital to what we're doing on a daily basis." And I talked about the head of legal services, the general counsel. She became a powerful ally because she heard he's going to rip out SharePoint, and she stood up and she said, "No, you're not, because I need it. We use it for these forms, and it's really, really essential, and you can't do it." So what ended up happening? The line held. Because of all of these forms and workflows, because of all the user adoption, this really important stuff that's going on, he wasn't able to rip out, or he had to severely slow down his thought process on ripping out SharePoint. And ultimately what happened was that the organization hired in some management consultants who decided that the IT department should be split into two and it should report to other folks. So no more IT department, no more need for a CIO. So I look at it as a little bit of a karma payback. So the line held. So SharePoint remained where it is, and then once that gentleman left the organization, then everybody did a complete 180. Okay, SharePoint's great again. We're going to continue to use it. So what ended up happening is that not only did the usage of SharePoint, continue, the project wasn't ripped out, but it also accelerated. So there was a renewed interest in using SharePoint for doing stuff. And they're looking at, this is all 2010. They're looking at migrating, and they're looking at Office 365 and what it can do. So really it was a good thing. And now SharePoint is healthier than ever at this organization. Had the SharePoint implementation remained the way that it was back in 2010, I'm convinced that it would have been ripped out, and rightfully so. But because we created all of these forms and workflow solutions that people relied on to do their daily jobs, it helped save the implementation. I'd like to finish off today's presentation by saying that forms and workflows equal opportunity. If you're working on a SharePoint engagement, or you're working for a company that uses SharePoint, and you see that user adoption is lagging, people just aren't using it. If you haven't yet already looked at forms and workflows, I highly encourage you to do so. They're an easy way and a very quick way to gain immediate user adoption in your SharePoint implementation. Thank you for allowing us to bring you another tip to help you achieve transformational results in your business. Send us an email if you'd like to discuss how forms and workflows can benefit your organization, or you think you might benefit from our SharePoint experience. Email us at info@xgility.com. Again, I'm Dean Virag, and thanks for watching.